All right, this week we are starting our study of the Civil War. It'll take us 2 weeks, so this is part 1. If you want to follow along with your textbook, this covers sections 1 through 4, although once again, this presentation does summarize the textbook, so you don't necessarily need it to be successful. But this Civil War, obviously, between the North and South, so here on this painting you have the Northern soldiers on the left fighting the Southern soldiers on the right. Really brief background. Remember from last week, looking at the events leading up to the war, Abraham Lincoln is elected president in 1860, and that was basically like the last big event that kind of starts the war off. Southerners saw Lincoln's election as like the beginning of the end of their lifestyle. Lincoln had talked so many times in his campaigns about stopping the spread of slavery and how evil slavery was that they knew they did not stand a chance to keep slavery around once Lincoln and the Republican Party were in charge. So we know that by February of 1861, 7 states had left the Union to create their own nation called the Confederate States of America, also called the Confederacy. Shortly after, in April of 1861, Confederate soldiers attack Fort Sumter, which is a federal fort in Charleston, South Carolina, meaning it was controlled by the U.S. government. They are attacking basically as a show of, like, we are our own nation, we will do what we want. And it's the first official battle of the Civil War. The battle lasts for about a day and a half before the fort surrenders, making it the first official battle and first official victory for the South. So starting off here, we need to understand what's going on at the start of the war. So the Union is the northern states. There's 19 of them. It's that pale blue color on the map there. The Confederacy has 11 states, and they're yellow. And kind of give you some background on why the different sides would volunteer to fight. This was definitely a war over slavery, over keeping slavery or getting rid of it, but also people looked at it as, you know, some kind of like hometown pride. Like they're going to be either fighting to keep their nation or fighting to separate and make their own nation. And then there's a couple of states that have a special importance called border states. Border states were slave states that bordered the North. So they would be Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. They do have slaves, but they're right along that in-between spot in the middle of the nation. They're very important in both North and South because they contain some very important rivers and very important cities, including Washington, D.C. You know, the capital of the North is technically in a southern state, so it's kind of a big deal that Abraham Lincoln keeps control of Washington, D.C. Citizens from these border states end up going and fighting for both armies. So, you know, if they were pro-slavery, then they probably went with the South. If they were anti-slavery, they went and fought with the North. And so these border states, even though they had slaves, still stayed with the North. Sometimes they had to stay with the North under, you know, they were forced to, that Lincoln used the army to force them to stay in the North, and some chose to stay in the North. So when Lincoln takes over the presidency, he's got a couple issues to deal with right from his very first day as president. He's got to deal with this breaking up of the Union. Because remember, those 7 states left before he officially took over power. So he's got to figure out, how do I keep our nation together? He's also having to deal with the fact that these southern states are taking all of the property owned by the U.S. government in their state. So if there is like a federal fort in their state, the southerners are taking it. They're taking the war supplies that are there, like weapons, ammunition, and so on. He also has to deal with the fact that not all Republicans were in favor of the war. Some Republicans were saying, fine, let the southern states go. Who cares? Let's get rid of them once and for all and not have these problems. And other Republicans were in agreement with Lincoln that it's illegal for them to go and make their own country, that we need to fight a war and keep them together. So he doesn't even have full support of his own party at the start of this war. So as the war begins, there are several strengths and weaknesses for each side, and they each have their own strategy for victory. And I'm not going to read every single word on this. You're welcome to do that on your own. But we'll start with the North. They have some very important strengths. They have way more people than the South ever will. They have 22 million people in the North to only 9 million people in the South. They also have most of the factories. So when you have to produce things like guns and cannons and ammunition, all those factories are in the North, so they're going to be able to produce the things needed for war. The North also has more money and more farms, so they'll be able to support their soldiers, and they have way more railroads, so they'll be able to get the supplies and soldiers to the battlefields much quicker. They also have the brilliant leadership of Abraham Lincoln. But they have some major weaknesses. They have almost no well-trained military officers. We'll get into this in a second, but most of the officers who had experience actually leading troops were from southern states. So when the southern states secede, those officers go with their home state. So that leaves the North with very few trained officers and very few trained soldiers at all. The Northern strategy for victory has three parts to it. The North kept control of the Navy, so they're going to use their Navy ships to block southern ports and basically cut off their economy. They're not going to allow the South to buy or sell any items. So they're basically going to starve the South and make sure that they're not making any money. They also wanted to get control of the Mississippi River, because if you look back at the map, the Mississippi River more or less cuts the South in half. So if the North can gain control of the Mississippi, then that's going to be a major weakness for the South. And they want to attack and capture the southern capital at Richmond, Virginia, which is actually within just a few hours ride from Washington, D.C. So these two capitals are like within just a few hours of each other. On the flip side, the South has a couple really important strengths. They have excellent military leadership. Remember, most of those officers and most of those trained soldiers who actually went to school to be a soldier or an officer go with the South. They have a very, very large territory, so for the North to invade them and conquer them is going to be a very difficult thing. So the South is saying, hey, you're fighting on our homeland, we actually know what we're doing. And that leads us to the last strength. They have very good morale or good confidence. These Southern soldiers know the territory, they're fighting for their homeland, they have the support of the people, so that's a huge confidence booster. The weaknesses for the South include the fact that because their territory is so large, it is difficult to defend it, and they could very easily be split in half. They have very few factories, so they're not going to be able to produce the items needed for war, like guns and ammunition. And remember, back a couple weeks ago, we talked about how the South actually did not want to have railroads in their region. Well, that's a problem now. They have very limited transportation methods. They do not have a very good road network, and they have very few railroads. So getting troops and getting food and getting supplies to the battlefields is going to be very difficult. The South decides to fight a defensive war. They are not going to go out and attack the North. They're basically just going to defend their homeland. They're going to wait for the North to come to them. But they do want to try and capture Washington, D.C. Remember when we played Capture the Flag? Usually if you can get your enemy's capital, it's game over. And they decide that they're going to try and get help from Europe to support their cause. So they especially want to get help from Great Britain. They sold much of the cotton that they grew to Great Britain, so they thought maybe we'll actually get them to come and help us fight this war. So the battles start with a place called the Battle of Bull Run, and you can go ahead and look at the details on these maps. We're not going to go over military history, like battle history, so if that's your thing, there's plenty of resources online. But the very first official battle of the war happens in July of 1861 at the Battle of Bull Run. Basically, the Union troops, those northern troops, were very untrained and basically got scared right at the beginning. They were very easily overwhelmed, and it was a clear victory for the South. The northern troops literally run off the field in a panic. Lincoln realizes this is really bad, that his troops were so easily scared off in just a few hours. So he really pushes his generals to put into action a plan to capture Richmond. And so there's a bunch of battles that happen in 1861 and 1862 around Washington, D.C. and around Richmond, Virginia to try and capture Richmond. So you can go ahead and look at that map. But we've got battles, things like the 7 Days Battle, the Second Battle, Bull Run. They fight another one there. You've got Chancellorsville. You've got Fredericksburg. You've got all kinds of these battles, so just go ahead and look at that map. In the meantime, while the North is losing all these battles around Richmond, they are doing some good things. On the ocean, the Union is able to quickly blockade or block all of the southern ports, so their plan there is going well for them. They're going to basically kill off the southern economy. And in the western states, out in Kentucky and in Tennessee and Louisiana, the North is winning quite a bit. So the Union was able to quickly capture New Orleans. That's the opening of the Mississippi River, so they're putting that part of the plan in action. And they're able to capture really important forts in Kentucky and Tennessee to control the middle part of the country. So in Virginia, the Union is not doing well at all, but in other parts of the country, the Union is. And then we have one of the most important battles of the war, the Battle of Antietam. And again, if you want to learn more specific details about these actual battles, you're welcome to do that research on your own. But the Battle of Antietam is a one-day battle, happens in September of 1862 in Maryland. This is one of the very few times that the South is actually going to go and invade and attack the North. The South feels that a victory in Maryland would convince the state to join the Confederacy. Remember, Maryland is still a northern state technically. The South also thought if they could beat the North on their own soil, that maybe those European countries would come and help them out. In this battle, there were 75,000 Union soldiers versus 55,000 Confederate soldiers. This ends up being the single bloodiest day in all of U.S. military history. More soldiers died in this one day than have died in any one day of any other American war ever. We have about 23,000 casualties in this one day of fighting. That's North and South added together. A casualty means that that person was killed or injured during the battle. It is considered a Northern victory. The South lost so many people that they had to retreat back into Virginia. So the North says that they won it because they did not have to run away. The thing is, the North could have finished the war here and then. If they had just chased the Southern troops back into Virginia, they could have crushed them right then and there, but they didn't. The North stays put in Maryland. The war is going to continue on for many more years after this. And now let's look and see what's going on outside of the war with the civilians. Women play really important many important roles during the war. As you know, thousands and thousands of men and boys are going off to war, the rest of the nation still has to keep going. So women step into roles that were not traditionally women's jobs. So they take over running the family farms, running businesses, getting factory jobs. Those bullets, those guns, they are not making themselves. That's women taking over those jobs in those factories. They also become really important members of the military, serving as messengers behind battlefield lines. You know, the men were needed to fight, so they're running messages back and forth, scouting out where troops are, where like good road systems are. They're even serving as spies. Some women went so far as to disguise themselves as men and join up in the fight. You can read stories about that. The most common role for women, though, during the Civil War was to serve as nurses, both on the battlefields themselves and at military hospitals. Dorothea Dix comes in. We've heard of her. Clara Barton, who was known as starting the Red Cross, gets her start here in the Civil War. And medical care during the Civil War was also very important. Weapons technology was advancing to much more powerful cannons, much more powerful rifles and guns. But the medical treatment did not improve along with the weapons. Doctors had no idea how to prevent infection. They had no idea that they should wash their hands with soap and water or to clean their medical equipment. Oftentimes they went from cutting one guy's leg off to, dealing with another guy still with the first guy's blood on his hands or on the saw used to cut his leg off. More men actually die of disease and infection in the hospitals than they do of or in battle itself, and many soldiers refused medical treatment because they were more likely to die. We do have some medical developments during the war that will help improve things. So we have an ambulance system that is invented, better surgical tools. This is actually the start of plastic surgery to try and repair people's appearances after these horrific injuries, using anesthesia during surgeries instead of just making them be fully awake and aware. So again, these are all just real basic things. If you want to know any more details about these, you're welcome to do that research on your own. But use this to help you out with this week's activities, and we will look more at the Civil War next week.